The missing voices. Purdah and historical erasure. The last slide. We followed the fire. We sat in the hujra, heard the verses travel from mouth to mouth, and watched how Khushal Khan's poetry moved through the bodies of Pashtun men gathered in communal assembly. It was a powerful story of how literature becomes revolution, but there is another story. One that the historical record has almost entirely failed to tell. It is the story of the women. The hujra was a strictly male domain. The tribal council, the jirga, was a male institution. The public performance of political poetry, the communal memorization of war verses, the emotional rituals of martial mobilization, all of it took place in spaces from which Pashtun women of the tribal aristocracy were structurally excluded by the Purdah norms of their world. Now, this was not incidental. It was the architecture of a society that drew a firm line between the public world of male honor and the private world of the domestic sphere. What this means historically is that the women of Khushal Khan Khattak's community, the women who lived through the same Mughal oppression, who lost the same income when the ferry rights were revoked, who sent their fathers and brothers and sons into the mountains to fight Aurangzeb's armies and waited in silence to learn who would return. These women encountered his political poetry not as primary members of its intended audience, but as secondary, filtered recipients. They heard fragments brought home by male family members. They absorbed what the private domestic sphere allowed to enter. And then there is Bibi Mariam. She was Khushal Khan Khattak's daughter. And by the testimony of later Pashto literary tradition, she was a poet. The biographical dictionary tradition, the Tazkira, credits her with poetic composition. Her father, the man who theorized the warrior-poet synthesis and raised a family of literary practitioners, had a daughter who wrote. But here is what the scholarly record reveals, and what honest history demands we name plainly. The surviving authenticated verses specifically attributed to Bibi Mariam are systematically absent. The Tazkira tradition that preserved her father's words, her brother's works, and her grandson's poetry did not preserve hers. Or if it did, those manuscripts have not survived in forms that scholars can authenticate. She is a name with a reputation but almost no recoverable voice. This is not an accident. It is the consequence of a documentary tradition, the Tazkira, the biographical dictionary, that was built by men, for men, to preserve a version of the past organized around masculine warrior intellectual identity. Women's cultural and intellectual lives existed in that world, but the institutions designed to remember them were not interested in the remembering. There was, however, a form that survived, precisely because it did not depend on those institutions. The landai, the traditional two-line oral form of Pashtun women's poetry, has existed for centuries as a parallel, invisible counter-narrative to male public verse. Short, anonymous, collectively owned rather than individually attributed, the landai was the medium through which Pashtun women recorded their grief, their longing, their fury, their political responses to the events that the men around them were busy commemorating in formal verse. When a battle was fought, the men wrote qasidas. The women composed landai, shorter, sharper, and often more emotionally honest. When a son was sent to war, the landai carried what the hujra would never say. When an empire crushed a tribe, the landai held the weight that formal political poetry was too proud to acknowledge. These voices ran alongside Khushal Khan's world like a river running underground, present, powerful, shaping the terrain above them, and almost entirely invisible to the historical record that chose to look only at what the surface showed. To tell the story of Khushal Khan Khattak honestly is to name this absence, not to fill it with invention, but to insist that the silence itself is evidence. Evidence of what the world he lived in chose to remember, and what it chose to let disappear. The missing portrait on this slide is not merely symbolic. It is the most accurate image history has left.